if someone wants to have a real discussion with me and Stan, we want some examples. We've been looking for examples, and we've considered a lot of them and discussed them, and showed that they're not appropriate. They're not really representative of any kind of relic dialect in the United States. And so if you claim that a language is a certain nature, you've got to give examples of it. And you got to give examples or counter non-examples of what it shouldn't be. You throw in that thing, his oral genius or something like that, that solves everything, and it solves nothing because it's not a theory. It's a theory when it can be disproven. And if he's got this genius that he's, piling on top of everything else, and he's got all these books he's absorbed and all of this, you can believe that, but there's just not going to be much support for it, specific support. There's none, in fact.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. This is part 2 of the interview I'm doing with linguistic scholar and Book of Mormon expert Royal Skousen. Go back and check out part 1 where we talked a bit about the Book of Mormon translation and his scholarly work as well. And we're going to be just continuing on asking more questions in this part. So you established in the last part that you believe, your view and you believe the evidence supports that it was a tight translation, that Joseph Smith is reading it word for word off the stone, supporting the testimony of eyewitnesses, and you also think the original manuscript supports this as well. So one of the questions that people have, and this is a question I had whenever I came home from my mission, is if this was a tight word for word translation by God or some sort of divine translator on the stone. Some people can have some concerns when they learn about that there's been revisions or some small changes to the text in later subsequent editions. You talked about that a little bit before. There's not really any giant, massive, significant ones doctrinally or loads of things being added to it, but some corrections here or there. But somebody might think if this was a word-for-word translation from God through the translation instrument, how could any changes be made? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's what I follow. I am trying to restore what Joseph Smith saw, and so if I believe that that's the evidence, this is what he saw, I put it in there, and I don't worry about whether it's bad grammar or whatever. I go by the textual evidence. This is the common practice in textual criticism, is to pay respect to the sources and what they're saying. It has to make sense, of course, and it can't be just idiotic rubbish that you're putting down. But I find that, first of all, the Book of Mormon doesn't have much editing. Actually, I don't think there's really any editing where it's trying to change the meaning, that Joseph Smith felt like, oh, this was bad and I should change it. We do have this in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Right.
Because when they discovered that the law wasn't going to allow them to have the law of consecration the way it was first revealed, they changed the revelation and rewrote it. And they never did this with the Book of Mormon. So there are a couple of errors that involve doctrine, but they're errors, and I correct them in the Yale edition. So my feeling is we shouldn't make the changes. Now, if you notice, though, Joseph Smith is 94% of his changes are just upgrading the language to modern English from early modern English, and also Book of Mormon English. There's some Book of Mormon English that's different from the early modern, and upgrading that too. and it's to make it easier for the reader. Now, I think if you view this as, well, he's translating. He's trying to give us a translation that will help us. We translate the Book of Mormon into other languages, into even pidgins and creoles and all kinds of weird things, and we think that's perfectly fine. So if you look at this as he's correcting it, your job is, we're correcting bad grammar and stuff like that, then you got yourself in a corner, sort of. But if you say, no, Joseph Smith's just trying to get a text which people won't stumble over things, then it's okay. I just don't. We do it all the time in our translations into other languages, and we have to make decisions and so forth. And sometimes we can't get it exactly right, but we do the best we can.
So do you think he felt almost at times that he had the liberty or the, say, prophetic authority to make some clarifications, like some of the specific ones that people point out is like changing Mary being the mother of God to the mother of the Son of God, or Jesus Christ being the eternal Father to the Son of the eternal Father?
Now these are real. I mean, you shouldn't have done them. I mean, I don't. A Baptist periodical complained that this was the Roman language, the Catholic, in other words, the Catholic language, the Mother of God. And but if you go reading through the whole Book of Mormon, it talks about Christ as being the Father and the Son. It's not a problem, and I keep it there. I don't change it, it does look like it's a substantial change. I don't think it's that big a change, but again, it's Joseph Smith trying to remove a stumbling block in the text. For Mormons to read the Mother of God, it does sound like Catholic kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so we remove it. But of course, a textual critic comes along and says, it's really okay. We do believe that she was the Mother of God, and so the Gospel of John, in particular, is very strong in not distinguishing between the Father and the Son. It's really quite amazing that it does it this way. So I don't find those really big changes either.
And would you feel the same about the white and delightsome passage being changed to
that
pure
one's
delightsome?
wrong. That one's absolutely wrong. Joseph Smith came to a passage where it's the only one. There are 7 others, I think 7 others, that talk about the skin of the Lamanites becoming white in the future or currently. There's at the beginning of 3rd Nephi, there's this example. And this is quite possible if they have dark skin. But then he comes to the one that he changed to pure and delightsome, and it is referring to the descendants of Lehi and the Nephites. And here is Joseph Smith saying, well, the Nephites have light skin. That can't be, you can't change their light skin to white. It's already white. And so he put in pure because he didn't think it worked. He did not change any of the others that dealt with the Lamanites that he knew were dark-skinned. So you've got this one example where he does it, and it's a mistake because if you read the text of the Book of Mormon, it says that those that survived the last big battles and so forth will become Lamanites. They will take upon them and look like Lamanites. They'll have the color of Lamanites. And so it is true that these descendants of Nephi will take on a light skin. They'll become white and delightsome because they've become dark. And it's, I think, Alma 45, which talks about the descendants of the Nephites becoming joining in and becoming basically what do I want to say here? Become Nephites. Well, no, they're going to be they become Lamanites because you can't distinguish between them once they start intermarrying.
So you're
And
saying you think that was a mistake of Joseph to correct that
yes,
verse
it
to
was a
turn to
mistake
Lexham?
because he thought the descendants of Nephi should be dark, light skinned, and they were already light. So why should it say change to white? So he didn't want to say black because that wasn't what so he just put in pure, just put in pure. Pure does not work. I go through in the write-up in ATV, the fourth volume, I go through why pure and delightsome doesn't work. And white and delightsome is correct, and it's referring to dark-skinned Nephites, not light-skinned Nephites. But Joseph Smith was a great believer in light-skinned Nephites. You know, he talks about Zelph, and he's got all these sort of folklore examples. But I think he was just wrong. See, he doesn't change any of the others. If he's just trying to get rid of racism, as some people have said, you know, and just change it that way, then what about all the rest?
Yeah.
You know, you can't. They're all talking about the Nephite Lamanites. I'm sorry, becoming light skinned.
Yeah. There's
Now,
still like
this is
Second
of
Nephi
course
5 that talks
this
about the curse of the
this is
skin.
something, of course, we can't believe in these days with our scientific views of DNA and so forth. But I'm not going to worry about it. It's what's in the text. I think white is correct. I put it back in.
Hmm.
So almost anything which people say Joseph made this change and so forth, and it's really substantial, I reject it. I mean, he shouldn't have made it. And I think I can
So am I
find
right in
evidence
thinking
for it.
that you almost feel like there really shouldn't be any changes done to the original edition of the Book of Mormon? Maybe not necessarily saying that God is displeased with it, but you feel that we should have stuck with the original text that Joseph dictated to Oliver Cowdery.
Well, it is a little difficult because some of these words like Aaron, you might want to, you know, I don't put a footnote in the Yale edition, but it might put a footnote, you know, Yale means message here, you know, and give the OED and stuff like that. But I decided not to put any notes in the Yale edition. I just wanted a pure text. I think people need to confront the Book of Mormon straight on, without notes, without explanations, without even telling you this is first Nephi and this is second Nephi and this is third Nephi. And, you know, I don't think people are as dumb as Grant Hardy thinks they are. You know, he thinks we ought to have this annotated Book of Mormon. And I think it's really, you just read through it, it's pretty straightforward. And I think it'll work in its original form. And that's sort of the way I've worked from.
Hmm. Okay, so you talked about before early modern English and what some had viewed as bad grammar. Some of this being corrected from the first
Yeah,
edition. You give examples of like they was yet rot or
yeah,
wrath
yeah,
or in
that's our
them
favorite
days.
one. And those are
People
our
would point to like this sounds like folksy grammar, and people would use that in the past as like this isn't evidence that Joseph Smith was the translator, that he participated in in the translation, his language, his vernacular of the day. And you and Stan Carmack's research, you believe that this is early modern English, so acceptable grammar between the 1500s to the 1700s, but
yeah,
making the argument that this isn't the language and vocabulary of Joseph Smith, but you believe that this is a divine translation that he was reading
yeah,
in early modern English. So I guess,
yeah. That's what I believe. It's worth. The real issue is, you know, can you find things in Joseph Smith's language that aren't in early modern English, and vice versa? Can we find things in the Book of Mormon early? that's there that's not dangerous. And we do find some.
Mm-hmm.
And Stan has been quite good at identifying some of these. The last article he will have in part 8, which is in, we're about 90% typeset. He will undertake a number of the syntax issues, showing that these did not exist in Joseph Smith's language. It did not exist in the language of people that wrote in pseudo-biblical language. They'd write something with these and thous and so forth, sound biblical in their style. And they never even really approach the kind of language we have in the Book of Mormon. So there are some differences too, but the majority, when you just hear in them days, that's dialectal. But what you didn't know was that it was acceptable in 1600. Now that means it's, as far as that one goes, it's either one. It could be either Joseph Smith's upstate New York, or it could be, this early modern English.
Right.
But Stan finds examples which only work for early modern English and not for Joseph Smith. And
so you're saying
talks about it.
that you've not found evidence, because one pushback or explanation I've heard from other people or scholars, either faithful or unbelieving scholars, is that some of this archaic early modern English could have existed in these sort of rural communities, up in around New York area, and if they're imitating sort of the language of the Bible, that would explain.
Okay, let me just say this: you can make that claim, but it's worthless unless you give me an example. Mm-hmm. And everybody that has said that statement, that it's a relic, part of a relic dialect of upstate New York, not one of them have given me an example, this word in the Book of Mormon or something like that. I've got no counter examples, from these people. And I just look at that and say, look, it's up to you guys. If you think this is, you've got evidence, give us some evidence and we can go study it. And so Brant Gardner is always saying this. He gives no examples. I refuse to quote him, because he hasn't given me an example to talk about. And I don't think he's got one. It's sort of blowing in the wind. You could say, we can tell that this language comes from a farm boy living out in Nebraska, and you could probably get just about as far with a farm boy in Nebraska as you can somebody in upstate New York. You're going to see colloquialisms and stuff like that. Well, so my view is, if someone wants to have a real discussion with me and Stan, we want some examples. We've been looking for examples, and we've considered a lot of them and discussed them, and showed that they're not appropriate. They're not really representative of any kind of relic dialect in the United States. It's a nice idea, but it's not proof. It's just an idea. And so I won't quote people that won't give me any examples. They're afraid to give me one.
And did you say before that you had was it Dallin D. Oaks do research for you? Because he's a linguistic scholar.
Yeah, he went back and he went through basically handwritten letters. They had to be handwritten, and evidence that they were done by the person, who not written for somebody else, and then he went through the grammar and all that. And it's mostly the typical kind of they was. You get those kind of things, You don't get any of the vocabulary stuff that's in the Book of Mormon. You don't get any of this complex. You don't get anything like if and, or if and then. You don't get those. You don't get those at all. So almost everything that's unique to the Book of Mormon is not found in these writings by people. So
And has his
just,
research caused him to sort of lean more with your view of the translation being early modern English, and that this early modern English likely wasn't actually existing in these world
well, he's
communities?
just stuck with the issue that, he can say that it is coming from that time period of 1800. He is getting what the language is like in 1800, and he's finding none of the particular things we find in the Book of Mormon, like those extra ands, being shoved in. Never found any of those examples. And there was one scholar who said he found it in Joseph Smith's writing, revision in the Doctrine and Covenants, and he had it completely wrong. He didn't even understand what it was. He didn't give the
Right.
right example.
Because that was going to be my next question, because I've heard some people say that, early modern English, does it show up in the Doctrine and Covenants, the revelations of Joseph Smith? And if so, would that sort of undermine early modern English not being part of the vernacular of Joseph Smith? What are your thoughts on, is there early
Well,
modern
we
English
haven't. You take that, the if and there are none in the Doctrine and Covenants,
Mhm.
just not there. The word use of retain, meaning to take back, is not in the Doctrine and Covenants. I mean, the things that are key elements that are unique to the Book of Mormon, we aren't finding in the Doctrine and Covenants, say, and Pearl Great Price and so forth. And so I think that's showing that there's some difference here that we ought to pay attention to. It is true that you're going to get other, Sidney Rigdon was going through the Doctrine and Covenants, making a mess out of it, correcting, what he perceived to be bad grammar. And that's what we typically have. If you go look at the Joe Smith papers, that's what the marks are being made by him in correcting the grammar. But we don't find these special kinds of things, like those Hebraisms, the king. Well, you're not going to get the king particularly, but the governor, so and so, the governor with his name. You don't get that. You just, the things that are particular about the Book of Mormon aren't showing up in the other sources. But Stan thinks that there is some of this. And I've been more negative about it because I think I don't know why he wants it, but I don't think it's really there.
So he thinks he sees some examples maybe in the Doctrine and Covenants, but you don't find it as
They're
strong
not
or
really convincing, and they're anyway.
not
I
throughout as
haven't
much as you see in the
gotten
book.
the ones I just mentioned. He doesn't have any of those kinds of examples. But he does find certain kinds of conjunctive elements and so forth. So there are some things, but it's not like the Book of Mormon. So I just I've put that one on the shelf and indicated that I don't think we can go much on it. One of the problems with the Doctrine and Covenants doing it is that every section is different. Every section has multiple sources. They wrote down copies of those and distributed them, widely, and so they vary. The Joseph Smith papers were told they could not do a critical text of the Doctrine and Covenants, so the church didn't want it done. Afraid it might end up looking like mine. I don't know, but I don't think it would actually. And I think it needs to be done, but it's much more complicated because of the multiple sources. You don't, whereas the original to section 1, it's hard to pin it down. You got all these different sources. So, Anyway, I don't think they find much there.
Okay, so you don't think that it's as paramount or it's as strong as we see in the Book of Mormon as in the Doctrine and Covenants, and maybe there needs to just be more work on it as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so. But I'm right now. I think Doctrine and Covenants is more actual Joseph Smith's language
right.
and not a prepared, text for him.
So
The
so
Book of
one
Mormons. Okay, go ahead.
sorry, this question came to my mind. I don't think I actually wrote this one down, but I'm sure you've probably been asked this question before. One person might maybe offer pushback to the notion of Joseph Smith not being the translator per se, but sort of like the reader of the translation. And then they might point out, Doctrine and Covenants 9, where Oliver Cowdery tries to translate it and fails, and he's like, "Why couldn't I translate?" And the Lord is basically saying like, "Oh, you thought I would just give it unto you with, but you had to study it out in your mind." And some
Yeah,
might say, does that not support there being some sort of intellectual component or studying out in his mind that
yeah.
Joseph was involved in the translation? What's your thought on, Doctrine and
Well, I
Covenants
think
9?
that's a big mistake, that interpretation. I think what he needed to get was a spiritual confirmation that he should do it, and he got nothing. So he couldn't do it. I don't
Hmm.
think he ever tried, actually.
Oh,
And
okay. So you don't think he tried and failed? You think he never attempted?
yeah, well, he knew the Lord was telling him that he had to get a spiritual confirmation that he should do it, and he didn't get it. And
Hmm.
so there's no evidence anywhere for him being a translator. There is one place where he took over, or where Joseph Smith took over for him, 28 words.
Hmm.
But the evidence in the environment is that Joseph Smith, or not Joseph, but Oliver, the scribe, is falling asleep
Oh,
and
okay. So Joseph's
finds
still
that
translating, but he's taken over as scribe for a
and
little bit.
he took over and had to read, had to look and write himself what he was viewing, and um, that was the only time they ever did that. And Oliver typically did not fall asleep, but there he was, and you can see it in the line above. It dribbles into nothing, which happens to me when I'm falling asleep and writing. So I just I think we misunderstand what he was trying to get permission. He was really unsure of himself. We make Oliver Cowdery out to be too smart. We want him to be, just as smart as Joseph Smith or something, but I don't think he was. He felt inadequate and was, in fact. So ultimately, we find, for instance, his spelling improves, and he really is trying to learn to be better. He was a go getter, trying to be successful, and he always wrote up stuff like it's just awful prose. Those letters to W. Phelps, I can't even read them because he says he's going to talk about how the translation took place, and he goes on for page after page and doesn't tell us anything. It really gets boring, and I don't like that. I think he was a pompous ass, basically. And Joseph Smith never had to do this in his writing. It's all very straightforward, and he doesn't. But Oliver, if you read that stuff, you say, "My gosh, how could anybody want to even read this?" And they printed them for us. I don't think much of them.
That's funny.
So,
Okay, so I had a question on here because I've read both from critics who are trying to come up with naturalistic explanation, but even some faithful scholars have said that there's some phrases that sound similar to like what Joseph might have encountered at revivals. I think I give you an example like I felt the pains of a damned soul,
oh
and some
yeah,
people have pointed to these evangelical or revivalist sort of phrases or language that therefore showing this is either a 19th century translation that this is language Joseph is drawing upon, or it's a 19th century text if you take a critical view. What's your thoughts on some of these revivalist phrases?
Well, they've been, as Grant Hardy, these people always, Grant Hardy once sent me 30 of these things. And in 1 hour, I got 28 of them in early modern English. See, they don't know early modern English. So they think, oh, this is obviously revival from Joseph Smith time. But the language of Joseph Smith revival is dated. It goes back to the 1500s, and that's why they're the same. And so I would we just and Stan Carmack took another hour to get the last two. So all 30 of them failed. So at least Grant Hardy gives me examples, like the one you gave is one of those in the list. And they read and they say, "Oh, that's got to be that can't be original with Joseph Smith. It can't be original with." But it's just during the 1800s, during his
It's
life.
unique to that specific time. But you're saying that you find a lot of those phrases go back to early modern English.
Every one of them. They have not yet given us one that we can't find.
All right, that's everyone's homework is to find you one.
They've thrown dozens of them at me, and if I can't find them, then I give them to Stan, and he finds them. We work with early, what is it, EBO, early English, something online, but it's a great data source that gives all the writings from about 1470 up through what is it, up to about 1700 through the 1600s. And it's got tons of religious writings. That's one of the really good things. And boy, these phrases show up. And these people go on Google and they can't find them back then because Google isn't really a very good search engine for the older things. But the EBO one is specifically prepared to deal with this kind of stuff, and we find them all. And so all they think is, well, I'll find another one, and it doesn't work for them, and they throw it out at us. Finally, we get sort of tired of it. We say, why don't you learn how to use EBO yourself so you can find out instead of just throwing them at us? But they don't exist. They don't exist just in Joseph Smith's time. And you see, religious Pentecostalism and all of these words and things, phrases, the 1800s isn't much different from the 1600s. We're gonna find them.
Okay, so you don't find it unique or exclusive to the revivals in the 1800s, and you feel like it can still fit in with your model of it being early modern
these very
English
phrases we find them in the 1600s. I mean, so they have not found common phrases in Joseph Smith's time that are not earlier. We've got every one of them we've been able to find. And that's why I listed in part, I think it's part 4, either 3 or 4. I just go and I took the challenge up, and I even listed Grant's 30 examples and gave the counter examples. And he thought just from the top of his mind, oh, these can't be early modern English. They've got to be Joseph Smith. See, we don't speak that language. We don't know what it's like. And we just automatically think, oh, this sounds Pentecostal, sounds like it comes from that period. But it isn't. We're finding it much broader. And so, again, it's those who want to find evidence to disprove what we're trying to do. They got to have evidence, got to have examples.
Okay.
But anyway.
So you touched on earlier about Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon, and I just wanted to, quick clarification. Is your view of some of these Hebraisms that we talked about before, if unconditionals, do you think it fits better as Hebrew from the underlying text making its way into the translation, or do you see it more as these Hebraisms being like an expression of, King James Bible sort of language and early modern English?
Well,
What's
it
sort of your
definitely
take on that?
isn't. It isn't King James because King James translators removed all of those extra ands in their translation. There are none in the King James Bible. Well, I view it as I've come to the view that those extra ands are a part of their original language, and it may have derived in the long haul from Hebraisms, but it's not equivalent because it's own. In Hebrew, if you say, if you come, then I'll come, that and will be in there. It'll be, if you come, and then I will come. Inevitably, it's always there. In the Book of Mormon, it's never there. And so there is some difference. And I'm perfectly willing to say, well, maybe this is just a reflection of the actual language that they were speaking, in the Book of Mormon. I don't know. I don't think I have to say, I don't say anymore it's a Hebraism. I say it's Hebrew-like.
Right. Leaving the door open that it could
Hebrew-like.
be, but not
Uh,
definitively.
some of my colleagues at the University of Illinois, when I was talking about this, were giving me some examples of other languages which have restricted use of those kinds of ands. So it may be that we just have to say this is the way the language is constructed because that has a very good purpose. That and tells you I'm bringing you back to the main clause with this and. That tells you something. And the ones in Hebrew, just any if and doesn't do that, but it does it in the Book of Mormon, so it has a special purpose.
Okay.
So, a lot of these things just mean there's a lot more research to be done. And I think people ought to, instead of throwing counter examples at me, go out and learn how to use these databases and study it out themselves and
Hmm.
see what they can find out. I mean, it's been too easy for these people to come up with counter examples, they think, and then in an hour, we've found examples of every one of them. And they still think, well, if I can just find one, and I'll undermine this whole thing. When thus far they haven't found any, so
Hmm.
I'll
Okay.
uh, I'll stick with it.
So final, maybe two or three questions, then I'll let you go. I appreciate all the time you've given to me. I wanted to ask your thoughts on, because it seems before were discovering this early modern English that you were maybe more open to, shall we say, the loose translation, or that Joe Smith was the translator and was receiving
Yeah,
the
yeah, I
revelation
was.
and rendering the meaning. I want to get your thoughts now on, like, I think two of the maybe best or most prominent um, theories of translation that are more in the loose model would be, Brent Garner's view that it's predominantly a functional translation, that it's Joseph's, rendering of the language and vocabulary. Blake Ostler has his expansionist theory. At times it's type, but at times he's expanding upon the ancient text, and he is very much actively involved as the translator. I guess, obviously, you don't agree with those theories. What would you just say to somebody who sides more with that?
Well, again, you see, I changed my mind because of the evidence. And to me, evidence, I come from a linguistic field where evidence is everything. And so if you claim that a language is a certain nature, you've got to give examples of it. And you got to give examples or counter non-examples of what it shouldn't be. And that's why I think those other ones fail because they're not really taking into account the the full picture of what you would need. So an expansionary one, you know, I don't think I don't know. Has he got a specific text where he says these are the expansionary ones and these are the non-expansionary, and this is why I know? Or is it just, it's sort of like they throw out these possibilities and then they just let it go. I mean, I've explained it, I've explained it because, same thing with upstate New York, I've explained it. It's upstate New York, you know. Well, you haven't given any examples of it. So what is expansion? What are the words that are expanded and how do you know?
Hmm.
It just I will use expanded when I find it necessary, and I will otherwise not use it. It's I don't I don't like that kind of way of approaching things. So I
Okay.
guess that's the best I could say about those. Unless they give me a specific example which will decide between their theory and my theory, that we don't have anything. But I think I keep giving lots of examples of and sort of stand that fit our hypothesis. So anyway,
Okay. So, and as someone, you've obviously studied and examined all the editions of the Book of Mormon more than anybody. I want to ask you about some critical or naturalistic views of the Book of Mormon. Like, you've got maybe like Dan Vogel or Grant Palmer, William Davis, who see that Joe Smith was one, a religious creative genius. He was either drawing upon maybe books or the Bible, King James Bible, Protestant style sermons, maybe drawing upon things from the view of the Hebrews and the mound builder myth. Maybe taking things like his own father's dream, for example, similarities to Lehi's dream, and combining that with his creative genius and oral performance. Why couldn't this just be his own oral dictation of a fictional story, and he's just drawing upon all these influences? Why do you not find that a plausible or a satisfying explanation for the Book of Mormon?
well, again, it's just one of these things being thrown out. What are the implications? What would tell us that this is right and mine's wrong? And I just don't see that it gives you much. You throw in that thing, his oral genius or something like that, that solves everything, and it solves nothing because it's not a theory. It's a theory when it can be disproven. And if he's got this genius that he's, piling on top of everything else, and he's got all these books he's absorbed and all of this, you can believe that, but there's just not going to be much support for it, specific support. There's none, in fact. None, in fact. He's basically an uneducated from the world's point of view. He's uneducated. He's dictating this text. Jack Welch always tries to get the number of days down. He thinks somehow if he gets it down to 60 or something, this shows more of a miracle than if it's 90.
Hmm.
And I once pointed out it doesn't make any difference. You could have people working years on this text trying to get it to be what it is, and they'd never get it. And I even said all the professors at Yale and Harvard, we could put them to work on creating the text of the Book of Mormon from all these books and all these sort of things, and of course they wouldn't be able to do it. And I jokingly said they've got all this time, they're not doing anything valuable, they might as well just work on creating a Book of Mormon. Never would have done it. Never would have done it. Never could have gone anywhere. It's you see what you have to really ultimately deal with, despite all the way it's given and all these things, is you have this text. Whether it was done with the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone or however it's done, you've got this text. And it's an incredible text. And I just don't think these people with their native genius, I mean, you could give me an example of maybe there is some text out there that's sort of comparable and just as deep in its, connections and understandings. But I think you'd miss it. because it is we have to ultimately deal with the Book of Mormon itself. That's the real thing that's sitting there in front of you. And I don't think it can be done except by the way that and Stan have been arguing. But there could be other ways, but I don't think these general ones expanded or what is Grant or what is
Grant Garner,
what is Garner?
sort of like a functional equivalent translation. Predominantly, I think you see some parts as like names being literal, but predominantly it's Joseph sort of rendering the meaning of the translation, which is almost similar in the way that you view it being a divine translator doing a functional sort of translation. So both
Yeah, but
bringing
now
up,
look, almost every phrase, this is one astounding thing. It's in the new book, part 7. Every phrase that is virtually every phrase, I'll say virtually every phrase occurs more than once in the Book of Mormon. In fact, usually multiple times. They get repeated all the time. And you can use that to decide whether you have an easy reading or a difficult reading and things like that. And I do that in part 7. And the text is just, it's extremely long and it's extremely repetitive. And people have complained about both of those. But
yeah,
that means it can be tested and against all the usage that you find for the book. So I don't go with the others because they're just blowing in the wind. They're coming up with, what is a functional equivalent? What is an expanded? I want some specifics. I mean, I'm very specific in mine. These are the words, that were given to Joseph Smith, and I'm defending it. I think it can be defended. I don't think the others can be defended because they're too general. They're not really theories. A theory is something that you can find evidence to disprove it. And if you can't think of any evidence that would count to disprove something, if a functional account accounts for any kind of thing, then it's not a theory. If it can account for anything. And I had this problem with the Joseph Smith papers, this fraudulent 2 leaves from Alma 3 through 5. And the Joseph Smith papers wanted to say they were legitimate. But it had about 45 unique properties in 4 pages. And that's just astounding compared to other legitimate finds and fragments. You don't get that many unique properties. But what did the Joseph Smith people say? Well, they said Oliver Cowdery is in Alma. He's just learning to be a scribe, and so he's making all these mistakes. Of course, 5 chapters later, he's writing normally and makes none of the mistakes, And so their theory is he's in an early state, and any kind of uniqueness we find is just simply because he's starting out as a scribe. Well, that isn't a theory because it can't be disproven. Anytime you find something new or different with Oliver doing in those 2 pages or 2 leaves, you just declare, well, that's because he's starting out. You can't. It's not disprovable, and
right. You can't ever falsify it or
can't
determine that.
falsify it,
Right.
and so it's worthless. Now, mine, I think, can be falsified. Well, it has been falsified. We have found things that are in the Book of Mormon which aren't, strictly speaking, in early modern English, like retain. Retain meaning to take back. It isn't in Latin. It isn't in English. And it's in the Book of Mormon, so I don't know what to make of it, but it's there. So I say there are things that sort of we find interesting, shall we say?
What do you say to some skeptics? I think this has come from people that really haven't engaged much with your work seriously, but who say that there's so many issues leveled against the Book of Mormon and Book of Mormon historicity, and you and Stan Carmack, you've come up with this early modern English thing as a last way to try to save the Book of Mormon, being like,
Well, yeah, I've
it's
heard
it's
that.
still inspired because early modern English, and there's no way Joseph could have wrote it. And people are saying that you're motivated to come up with these conclusions or interpretations as a way to resolve a lot of the criticisms that have been
Well,
leveled against
but
the
I
Book of
would
Mormon.
say we came up with it because we found it, not because we were looking for it and trying to say we had to have this. I mean, could we have gotten evidence for, Arcadian in in it? Well, we haven't found any evidence for Arcadian in the Book of Mormon. We just don't find these other things. These it is really there. It's how you deal with, the whole mass of it and what you should say about it. So I haven't said definitively this is what it is, but I'm narrowed in on being a revealed text to Joseph Smith. He's going to read it off. It's an amazing book. I give the glory to God. I'm not going to take it for myself. I'm not going to take it for even Joseph Smith. See, Joseph Smith we've made into the translator, yet he always used the word translator to mean transmitter. We believe in the Bible as far as it's been transmitted correctly. We don't believe in it because it's been translated correctly, because it hasn't been. I mean, and the Bible is just full of variants and so forth because they got all these manuscripts.
Right, there's so
And
many
I don't
different
think he meant
translations.
that. He just meant to say that we believe in the Bible as far as it's been transmitted to us. And I think that's the right interpretation. So, when he talks about I'm translating something, I think it really means he's getting a revelation. He's transmitting it to us.
Hmm.
It's a much different viewpoint of what he's doing.
Right.
Well, I know that, everyone's going to have views that they want to undermine this one, and that's fine. I'm willing to take them on if they come up with real falsifiable ones. But
Well,
see,
that's the great thing about scholarship is, people are continuing to research and they can propose things and I think it's good to try to challenge views and scholarship. And then, like you said, when Grant Hardy sent you those 30 things, you're able to research it and say, okay, I know you find something that was still consistent in early modern English. So I think it's a good way to try to be thorough and
yeah,
comprehensive. And I think the research and all the work you've done is really fascinating, and it needs to be taken seriously and taken into account as people are trying to weigh out for themselves. And I guess I just
right.
want to finish with maybe transitioning so much from scholarly findings and evidence to maybe devotional a little bit. Like, how would you say, what impact has your scholarly work and your research impacted on your testimony for the divinity and also the authenticity
Yeah.
of the Book of Mormon?
Well, I actually I got my personal witness uh, before I even came to BYU, and so it's not really connected with the work that I've done. And so I've always worked from the assumption that it's true, and I've just got to figure out what happened and how it took place. So it was going through a very difficult period of my life, uh, and I was going off to BYU to teach, and I needed to make some things square with the Lord. And I felt much like the Queen, who had the the feelings of hell, opened up upon her. And so I was reading that section, and when she comes out of her unconscious state and she says, "I've seen my Savior. He saved me from an awful hell." And that's what I felt. I'd been saved from an awful hell by my reading of the Book of Mormon and preparing myself. I was going to BYU and I needed to make sure I was square with the Lord. The witness was, as I was reading it, and it was, this really happened. A historical statement, not this was spiritually, true or something, or this is a text written by the Lord. It didn't do that. It said this really happened. And it read, of course, that she clasped her hands. And I haven't interpreted that to mean that must be the correct translation, because that's what the Spirit said it really happened. So it must have happened that way. No,
The
the
Spirit just
Lord,
told you the Book of Mormon is early modern English.
no, he never did that. I have never had that. I've come to that slowly. My Renee Bangerter 5 years earlier had done work on the vocabulary and come up with 3 or 4 examples of the archaic word meaning, and I resisted it. So I didn't easily just fall into this. Oh yeah, and it was another colleague that pointed out that, what is the phrase? Well, let's see. Oh, yeah, it's the pleading bar of God. And he says, I don't think it's the pleasing bar of God. In fact, it isn't pleasing. If you read one of the verses, it's quite negative. And so I thought, that could be true. And I went on the internet and I looked up pleasing bar. I only got things like a pleasing bar in Vegas, a pleasing bar in Los Angeles, whatever. That's all I got.
You'll find them in Ireland as well.
Yes, probably very good ones.
Yeah.
But pleading bar, I found everywhere in archaic English, 1600s. The pleading bar, I kneel before your pleading bar, done in literary works. I found it in legal. It died out about 1600. No, about 1700. It died out, the phrase. Although there's still a few people around that seem to know it, but they're quite rare. And there's a museum near Canterbury where they have the original legal judicial system, and they have the bar, the pleading bar, they call it. And that's where the person stood at and made his pleading. Pleading here doesn't mean even, I'm pleading my case. It means, what is your case? You're pleading. That's the original meaning of the word, and that's what it refers to. And so, a lot of people do not like that one, but I think it's the only one that works, and so I've been pushed towards these things. It's not that but once I see that maybe I ought to study it out, I try and study it out, find evidence both for and against.
One thing's for sure, nobody can question the amount of research and work. Like, you've dedicated decades of your career and your life to studying the Book of Mormon inside out. So people need to take seriously.
Sciatica is what it's given me. I sat too long in front of a computer.
It's not too good. You need to get outside as well sometimes. Well, final question then. This has been just a great discussion. There's going to be people who are listening to this who are just really fascinated, and they just want to research into the Book of Mormon and these translation theories and the evidence for the Book of Mormon and geography theories and those sorts of things. And then there's some people who listen to the channel who will be in some sort of a faith crisis or have some faith challenges. Maybe even applying to some things with the Book of Mormon. I know I've gone through seasons of loss of faith or wrestled with things archaeologically or anachronisms, textual anachronisms, DNA. There could be a host of things attacks against the Book of Mormon.
You can be overwhelmed by it all.
Yeah.
I stick with the text. as much as possible. I don't get into geography. I just try to say what the text is saying the geography is and let it be at that. So
any advice to those who are sort of wrestling, not so much giving answers to all those issues, but who are sort of wrestling between, reasons to believe in the Book of Mormon and evidence they see in favor, but then some issues or reasons going against? What sort of advice would you give someone who's wrestling?
Well, I think not rush to judgment. It's, study it out. And that's what Oliver Cowdery was supposed to do, study it out in your own mind. But I found that's, not to rush to judgment. There's, you just set certain things on the shelf that you can't deal with. And I've dealt with the language, which is something I can deal with. And I think found a lot of information in favor of it. I mean, ultimately, you have a testimony, which drives, the work one does. And so I myself don't have a problem of, reconciling my testimony with whatever the text is. I just go ahead. But, it does mean that the text we read is this cultural and creative translation. It isn't, I don't think it's a straight what was on the plates. And that bothers some people, I think since I've been promoting that, no one wants me to give a fireside anymore. So it's okay.
It's okay. That's why you're on here. We don't mind those controversial
ideas. You don't mind, but the wards don't want to hear about it particularly, and so that's fine. I think someday they will realize the importance of it the way it was, but it isn't like we've always taught it. We've always taught it that the plates had this text written on them, and Joseph Smith translated that text, how accurately you want, and he did it directly, and he's responsible for it, and so forth. I think that's wrong. So that doesn't help some people. It's hard to get your hands on it, get your hands around it. But that's I'm going to go where the evidence goes, as far as I can tell, and Joseph Smith will be up there waiting for me, I'm sure. Give me a word or two.
I'm sure you have a bunch of more questions to ask him.
You got a few things right, Royal, but you missed some other things.
Yeah. Well, Royal Skousen, this has been a great discussion. I've loved this time to bring you on and to talk about the Book of Mormon and all the research and work that you've done. I encourage listeners to check out his work as well. Check out the research, the articles, and the books that he's done as well. I'll put some links in the description. And if you enjoy this, give it a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future interviews with great scholars and experts like Royal as well. Comment and share. And we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
thanks, Royal.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.